One night in 1971, Douglas Adams, who had been hitchhiking across Europe at the time, found himself drunk and near to passing out in a field in Innsbruck, Austria, carrying with him on his person a guide called The Hitchhiker's Guide to Europe. And as all dreamy, starry nights have on occasion to do, especially when you're down and out as he was, it was laid thick with inspiration. As Douglas gazed up at the stars through ever-enclosing eyelids, he thought to himself, someone should write The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And sure enough, 6 years later, the saga began, as a radio show. Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and with this video, it's my hope to open some eyes and turn some heads toward the awesome wonder of Douglas Adams through his magnum opus, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And on what better day to commemorate his works than Towel Day 2013. As mentioned previously, Hitchhikers began as a radio program, though in its initial going was going to be titled The Ends of the Earth, until he would come to recall the Hitchhiker's title. This due to the fact that Adams had been taken by the idea of telling a series of comedy-driven sci-fi stories where each would end with the destruction of the Earth, which I have to say I found rather funny, as I myself had a similar idea for a series of stories when I was in high school, way before I ever even knew who Douglas Adams was or what Hitchhikers was. And with the serialized radio show becoming a national sensation at the time, being asked to write up the series as a novel seemed like the next natural step, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, largely with this video, I want to focus on the Hitchhiker's Guide trilogy of 5 novels, yes, you heard that correctly, which consists of the following titles: The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, Life, the Universe, and Everything, So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, and finally, Mostly Harmless. Without going fully in depth, as there'd be so much to cover, I'm just going to hit the highlights as I saw them, having read through the entire saga myself for the first time recently, and leave the rest to you, the listener, if in fact you find yourself intrigued so as to explore those wonders for yourself. To kick things off, let's look at the characters. Arthur Dent is your average, ordinary human being. Ford Prefect, by all accounts Arthur's best friend, is not. In fact, he is what the rest of us would call an alien, hailing from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Betelgeuse, and the majority of his time is spent writing reviews of hotspots and factoids for the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's thanks to Ford that Arthur's everyday post the start of the first novel are going to be racked with superb blunders, mind-bending realities, spacefaring, encounters with robots, aliens, the end of everything, the beginning of romance, and more misery than he can shake a towel at. And all he wants amidst all of this is a good cup of tea. What kicks off the saga and slams these two invariably together is literally the end of the world, which they soon find out has been scheduled for demolition so that a hyperspace expressway take its place, to be carried out by the grotesque and rather super effective at their jobs, Vogons. Their encounters aren't limited to these green hulking brutes with a reputation for some of the worst and most agonizing poetry ever encountered in all the universe, however, but also Zaphod Beeblebrox, the two-headed semi-cousin of Ford, who also happens to be the galactic president. Trillian, another survivor of Earth, formerly known as Trisha McMillan, who also has a kind of romantic interest in Zaphod, and Marvin the, by all accounts, heavily depressed robot or paranoid android. As the series unfolds, Arthur too comes to meet the aged Slarty Bartfast, whose planet-building skills can surely be lauded, a couple of trans-dimensional beings who've taken the form of little white mice, and by whose curiosity and the meaning of life, the universe, and everything led to the Earth being created in the first place. His finding and losing his soulmate Fenchurch, and finding, losing, and finding again his much unexpected daughter Random, encountering an alternate dimension doppelganger of Trillian, as well as the embodiment of a soul who he has encountered repeatedly through his life, time and time again, and both inadvertently and purposefully has killed as many times as he's encountered it, seeking vengeance against him for this fact. To say the saga is chock full of whimsical and even sometimes baffling characters would be an understatement, but suffice to say the aforementioned are largely the principal players, and arguably at the center of it all is the titular tome, The Guide, printed as it is with the words "Don't Panic" displayed across its jacket, and it sits as the repository of all the usefully useless knowledge the universe has to offer about every alien, every world, every vacation getaway, and every dive slum you could ever hope never to encounter. And there's also an emphasis on always knowing where your towel is, because as it's explained, one who always knows where his towel is usually one considered to have his bearings and wits about him no matter the given situation. Arthur and Ford just barely managed to escape the Earth's destruction in the first tome in the series, being rescued at first thanks to expansive amounts of improbability by a cast of slave labor aliens aboard the Vogon fleet's lead ship, and secondly by Zaphod and Trillian, who are star-hopping in their stolen vessel, the Heart of Gold, when the Vogons put Arthur and Ford out. Mysteries are set to unravel from the get-go about the creation of the world under these circumstances, and the answer to that grand question of the meaning of life. Suppressed memories of Zaphod seem to indicate he must know more about things than he even trusts himself to recall, as the cast seek to uncover what exactly is going on. And the resolution of the story, as compared to the film's take at least, isn't entirely fulfilling on its own necessarily, as you're left wanting so much more. But it does include, unlike the film version, one of my favorite realizations, when Marvin comes essentially heavily into play by causing an enemy ship's AI brain to commit suicide after encountering the depths of Marvin's deep-seated depression. But I think that is largely why I'm glad I picked up the Ultimate Hitchhiker's Guide Omnibus in that regard, as opposed to the singular novels. With each of them, there's a sense of suddenness to the endings. Even the final tome in the series has this to a degree, although with that one there's much more a sense of closure by the end. And so the series as a whole feels more like a complete saga, whereas separately would feel a bit more serialized, I guess is what I'm saying. But the trials for Arthur and his brood are only just beginning by the end of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, heading into the restaurant at the end of the universe, as, prompted by their ship being cornered in all directions by Vogons who would destroy them, in an attempt to finish the job of taking out all of Earth's former inhabitants, Zaphod comes to commiserate with his slightly dysfunctional grandfather's spirit, and soon finds himself facing a torturous execution. One thing leads to another, and the entire crew find themselves transported to Milliways, the literal restaurant at the end of the universe. Literal as in, Milliways sits within a time loop of sorts, so as to make the final implosion of the whole of the universe a backdrop for high-priced dining. It is perhaps best to describe this chapter of the series as the one wherein everyone is on the run. This does not necessarily include the currently deceased and as yet still rocking Hot Black DeSato, lead presence of the musical group known as Disaster Area, but does include the overwrought, overweight, and undesirable among the former inhabitants of the planet Golga Frinchum, which after the team inadvertently steal the rock group's stunt ship designed to fly into the sun by autopilot and just barely escape it with their lives thanks to a half-broken teleporter, splits them up and deposits Arthur and Ford on a Golga Frinchum sleeper ship, destined for a new world on which to colonize. The sleeper ship is full of the moronic, verbose, and lethargic bureaucrats, tax specialists, and advertising types Golga Frinchum was ready and willing to do without, and its captain sits in a bathtub on its bridge, where he's remained for the last 3 years. This brings, as you might say, Arthur and Ford full circle, at least in a sense, as the Golga Frinchum ship comes to crash on its new world, which turns out to be the Earth, and a prehistoric age of early mankind. It is shortly after this that we find the third novel of the 5, Life, the Universe, and Everything, beginning. And subsequently, as a footnote, this is where the 1980s BBC television version of Hitchhiker's Guide comes to end. Each incarnation of the saga in each of its respective mediums is usually different in some way, if not in multiple ways, which adds to the mystique and allure of getting into it, to my thinking. Because while the larger swathes of the story are the same, you're still bound to find differences and surprises unique to whichever version you pursue. And yet, did I find as I was reading the saga, the visual and vocal influences of the film's cast were invariably the embodiments of the characters as I was seeing them in my head. This because the film version was the first version I'd ever encountered. And so when Slarty Bartfast returns with not so much of a vengeance in the third novel, it was Bill Nighy's voice and appearance that embodied that character. And I have to say, it added a sense of legitimacy to it in my mind, as all of the film cast did for me as I read on. From Martin Freeman's Arthur Dent to Sam Rockwell's Zaphod Beeblebrox, Zooey Deschanel's Trillian, Warwick Davis and Alan Rickman's Marvin, and Mos Def's Ford Prefect. Although, after having watched the BBC serial, occasionally I noticed Arthur and Ford's voices alternating between Freeman's and Mos Def's with the actors that portrayed them in that serial, Simon Jones and David Dixon respectively. It's ultimately hilarious to find Arthur and Ford, who've been trapped on this past Earth for 5 or so years as this novel opens, suddenly encountering a couch, floating on the breeze one day, having come through an eddy in the space-time continuum, which is not a concept Arthur grasps all that easily, confusing it for the fact that a man named Eddie must in fact be trapped in the space-time continuum instead. But Ford knows that this sofa is the only means of their potential escape, and so orders them both to give chase after it. And they're successful, inasmuch as being warped off prehistoric Earth and onto modern-day Earth, just days prior to its eventual destruction once again at the hands of the Vogons, as happened originally. Here it is that they encounter Slarty Bartfast once again, who comes to them with the mission of saving the very universe from a planet whose people have not seen the stars in the heavens thanks to a cloud of dust surrounding their world. And once a spaceship comes to crash on it and they manage to finagle together a ship of their own and are capable of seeing the universe around them, decide it must not be allowed to exist henceforth, not least of which because it's all too distracting to the eyes. And it all revolves around the game of cricket, in a manner of speaking, which is somewhat explored as Slarty Bartfast goes over the history of said cloud-enshrouded planet, also known, albeit with a different spelling of the word, as cricket. This planet is not especially given to technological prowess, and so it is a veritable mystery as to how its inhabitants could concoct a spaceship of their own, let alone the army of militaristic robots later encountered, bent on seeking out a series of artifacts needed to unlock their homeworld, but not from the nebulous dust cloud, as it were, but from a time lock that was imposed upon them in the hope of keeping them at bay. Though their journey to this planet in the hopes of stopping the robots from unleashing damnation on the universe is not an easy one, as Arthur is at one point separated from Ford and Slarty Bartfast and comes to encounter the aforementioned embodiment of the soul he's most heinously and largely unintentionally destroyed over and over again, known as Agrijax. This soul having been reincarnated many times over, and usually as some fixture soon to die in Arthur's presence, no matter when or where he happens to be, from a swatted bug on Earth to a potted plant set hurtling to the ground miles above an alien world. And all the while, Marvin, as it turns out, is left to feebly grump on a world where mattresses are sentient and swamps are plenty. But what is most fascinating, especially perhaps to Doctor Who fans, who might see somewhat of a similarity to the Time Lords of that series, is the realization that Slarty Bartfast was at one time involved with an organization known as the Campaign for Real Time. Much akin to the Doctor's people of Gallifrey, the campaign is probably best described as observers of the myriad timelines and time zones that do not always correspond to a particularly coherent continuity, and which wish to keep things the way they ought to be. It is that same drive that once led him to that group that leads him now as being just slightly more than a voice cheering on the main heroes of the story, whilst trucking around the universe in a ship that looks like what is described as an Italian bistro, replete with tables, menus, bottles of wine, and patrons, which all serves as a type of power drive to it. Through the course of their travels, Zaphon and Trillian ultimately return to the fold as well, though they're not quite seeing eye to eye as they once were, and so their splitting up is not entirely surprising, yet how integral Trillian becomes in uncovering the intricacies of the mystery involved in the story is a welcome turn for her character. And then it gets a little weird.